Thank you, Stefan. So my name is Christine Ärdal. Thank you all very much for coming today. It's our pleasure to present our findings to such a distinguished group and to get valuable feedback from each and every one of you. So I get to do the exciting bits. I get to talk about, if I can figure this out, what are we proposing? How much is it going to cost? What will you get for paying that amount of money? And how are we going to do it? So I'm a rather simplistic person, so I tried to think about what are the big picture questions that I think most of you will be interested in. So Drive AB's recommended models, the what. To give you a little perspective about what we've gone through on this 3-year journey, Drive AB and Work Package 2, we have 3 types of participants. We have industry, as you know. We have academics, and we also have people that come from more of a policy background. So those 3 groups represent the work, the internal work from Work Package 2 and Drive AB. So what we did is we went out and we tried to identify every potential model that we could find about pharmaceutical innovation that might be helpful to incentivize as a new economic model for antibiotics. So we looked far and wide. We looked at WHO and the neglected disease space. We looked at other models. We also looked at other industries. So we started to go out and see what kind of other industries could have beneficial models that we could use. So we created a long list of models, and we found that there was about 35 of those that were actually unique characteristics. And we performed an internal evaluation of these 3 groups. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to think about, for these 3 groups, policymakers, industries, and academic, how did these models assess in regards to their ability to stimulate innovation for antibiotics, in their ability to stimulate a variety of actors to participate, because that's important. We don't just want large pharmaceutical industry stimulated, we also want SMEs, we want academics, and we want nonprofits. So once we did that, then what we've been doing is stakeholder feedback, and we've tried to talk to a lot of different people across a wide variety of stakeholder feedback. Now, based on that, we've come up with 4 models. 2 push. Push pays for research and development, and 2 pull. Pull pays for a result. So the 4 models, you can see that they're distributed along the R&D phases, because what you want to see is you want them to stimulate different types of activities. As Kevin said so well, a lot of these products will fail. So we want to make sure that here we get a lot, because they're going to, because of the scientific challenges that Dr. Tan talked about, fizzle out before they get over here. So what we're doing is we're trying to create a package of incentives that can work together in order to get the priority antibiotics out at the end that we need here. So the first is grants. Now, I think grants need almost no introduction. People are familiar with grants, non-repayable funds to research, generally through a competitive process. There's been a lot of activity going on with grants. There was a lot of activity before, and there's a lot of activity within the last year. And this is good. This is all good, solid work that's resulting in the antibiotic pipeline filling. You can see that CARB-X was launched, the UK-China Global Innovation Fund was launched. You also see that GARD-P has also been launched, but that's not included here because that's more of a partnering organization that's working with organizations. And of course, we also have the European Investment Bank's INNOFIN, which is repayable loans. So a lot of activities going on, and this is great. So what do we think for grants? Drive AB thinks that grants are fundamental. They are the driver for making sure that the priorities are set at an early stage so that the antibiotics come out at the end. You can target them towards the priority pathogens. You can target them towards the bottlenecks. They're a very flexible approach and a very worthwhile approach that can be used across. So we recommend that we continue to finance. The OECD's estimated the amount of grant funding at about $550 million per year. So definitely increase that, but ideally increase it by 50%. We've talked to a lot of funding organizations, and we know that there is the ability to absorb more capital. And if we can do that, then what we're going to do is we're going to see more and more robust pipeline, especially in the early stages. But we want to target the early and mid stages grants until the pipeline becomes more robust. And we want to focus on the priority pathogens. Now, the WHO has done a tremendous amount of work publishing the priority pathogen list earlier this year. And so now grant funding organizations have a chance to react to that and to start looking and tailoring their grant calls towards those priority pathogens to make sure that those gaps are filled. And mostly coordinate efforts. The second recommended model is something we're calling a pipeline coordinator. Now, a pipeline coordinator is an organization that actively works with developers to make sure that gaps within the priority pathogen list are targeted, because not all pathogens are treated the same. So what we've done here is we've looked at the WHO's priority pathogen list. We've got the critical and the high, and we've mapped the pipeline. So we have the clinical development space and we have the preclinical development space. And it's great. I mean, we've got 52 novel antibiotic candidates targeting these three critical pathogens. So this is tremendous progress. But you also see there's a lot of zeros around. So some of these pathogens are not as attractive as others. And we need to make sure that we have coverage and there's research and development going on in this space. So Drive AB's recommendation for a pipeline coordinator, which is an organization that works actively with developers to make sure that these gaps are filled, is to continue to support and expand support for organizations like BARDA, CARB-X, GARD-P that target and eliminate priority public health R&D gaps and take an active portfolio management role. So this is not to say that we need to necessarily create a new pipeline coordinator. We have BARDA, we have CARB-X, we have GARD-P. They're all doing great work. They all have the potential to absorb more capital. So what we're saying here is we need to build on and potentially look at expansion of mandate. Also, pipeline coordinators have the ability to use non-traditional financing. So grants are an effective way to finance research and development, but pipeline coordinators also could do things like take equity in a product. They could also look at taking forgivable loans, like the European Investment Bank does with its INAFIN, and also look at milestone payments. So there's a variety of tools that a pipeline coordinator could use to adjust to the specific target. The third recommended model is the market entry reward. I think most of you probably know what a market entry reward is, but it's a prize that's given at regulatory approval for a new antibiotic that meets pre-specified criteria. And that prize is a sizable prize, as Kevin mentioned, but it comes with strings attached. So it means that developers have to abide by sustainable use obligations, and they also have to abide by equitable availability obligations. So why do we need a market entry reward? I think it was Ed who talked about the profitability or the revenues of antibiotics. So here you see, and I should say thank you to Duke Margolis for these numbers, that we have antibiotics that have been launched in most recently, and we see the sales for the US market only from 2015. And you see that the sales here are modest at best, and this is the whole reason that we're here. So a market entry reward is what we call a delinked incentive. That means that the revenues are either partially or fully delinked from the product sales. Now this is one example here of partial delinkage. We can also have full delinkage, but what happens is a set of payments are given early on once the product receives regulatory approval in order to make that market more attractive for the developer. So we simulated the results of a market entry reward. We wanted to know, what could we expect? How many antibiotics do you think we could get out of the pipeline, given various sizes of market entry rewards? So in this, here's the number of antibiotics coming out, and here's the different sizes of antibiotic market entry rewards, from 0 to 3 billion. The green are completely new classes of antibiotics, and the blue are known classes, improvements to known classes, but this is for priority pathogens. These aren't Me Too products that don't deliver on a priority pathogen. These are actually products that add value. And if you look here, you see it goes up quite a bit, and then it levels off, and the same here. And so what this says is that the simulation, we did a 30-year simulation, and that if you have a market entry reward of 0, you can expect to get about 4 new classes of antibiotics within the next 30 years. Now that's not very much. With incremental innovation, the known classes, you could get about 15. But if you had a market entry reward of either 1 billion for partially delinked, meaning that they still get revenues from unit sales, or 1.25 billion from a fully delinked, the number of new classes increases by almost 5 times. So that's a significant improvement in order to develop these new antibiotics to meet priority pathogens, and these are all against the priority pathogens. So our recommendation for market entry rewards is, we really think that we've been talking a lot about market entry rewards now. There's a lot of buy-in on market entry rewards, and it's time to start implementing and testing through that. We're looking at an implementation of a market entry reward for a 20-year time period. We think 20 years is important. 30 years is what we simulated, but 20 years should be enough to show what kind of impact it's actually having on innovation. It takes a long time to develop a new antibiotic, and it can't be adequately tested within 5 years because you won't be looking at the basic science and lead molecules in that time. But you could start with a 3 to 5 year pilot. So this could be the first start, look at that, and that will help to see different ways of operationalizing the model. So our last model is not an innovation incentive in itself. It's called the long-term continuity model. So what's important here is, if you have a successful market entry reward, ideally, at the end of that 10-year period for the market entry reward, you'll still have a critical, important antibiotic that is rarely used. Now, what do we know about those types of products? Here's a paper from our Drive AB colleague, Celine Pulcini, who's here today, looking at forgotten antibiotics. And what Celine and her team did is they looked at 36 different older antibiotics in 39 different countries and looked at the availability of these antibiotics. And unfortunately, the availability of these older antibiotics is getting worse. So it's important that once we've discovered an important new antibiotic, and we're using it just like we should in a sustainable fashion, so we use it rarely, that at the end of the market entry reward, we don't lose it because it's not interesting for a generic company to produce or for the original developer. There's also another benefit, because testing the long-term continuity model can also test the implementation of a national-based or a collaborative market entry reward. So this could be one of the first steps that we take to see how we can participate in multi-country collaboration. So Drive AB recommends that we test a delinked model for an antibiotic with a fragile supply chain, but included as an access antibiotic in WHO's essential medicine list. And one of those could potentially be benzyl penicillin, which is increasingly hard to get a hold of. So those are the 4 models. Those are the what. So the next question was, how much? So to implement these 4 models, we estimate the cost of our recommendations to start out at $800 million per year in 2018. if the global community was about to start implementing, increasing to $1 billion in 2020 and 1.2 in about 2021. But this includes the $550 million that we already spend today. So the idea is that we increase the grants, get a more robust pipeline, early and mid-stage pipeline. But we think that there are some very promising candidates right now in clinical development that could be eligible for a market entry reward within the next 5 years. So those would be ideal to test the concept on. So we'll fill the preclinical pipeline with this and potentially have 2 market entry rewards. But this is a lot of money. As Kevin mentioned, this is a sizable amount of investment, but this should be new investment. Because if we start stealing money from access conservation and infection control, that just creates even bigger problems. And mostly, we also need to rest on the base of surveillance. So these are critical. So we shouldn't see that these calls for increased financing for antibacterial innovations should at all take away funding from any of these areas. It should actually be the opposite, because they need to work cohesively across all of these areas. Regarding the governance models, so we've looked at a number of governance models, looking at the financing arrangements and the governance structure to see what we could learn from that. So one of the first that we talked to was the International Space Station. So I'm not sure how much you know about the International Space Station, but this was an enlightening conversation from my perspective, because I thought something so complicated and so expensive must have a very bureaucratic and large system to govern it. But actually, the International Space Station is governed by bilateral agreements with the USA. So there's no convention, there's no treaty. This is a bunch of agreements between the US and the countries that are interested in participating in it. And they're very clear about the responsibility. So, for example, Canada has invested in the robotic arm of the International Space Station. So therefore, Canada pays for everything that has to do with that robotic arm. Japan bought a spaceport. Japan pays for everything that has to do with that spaceport. It's a very elegant way, it's very simple, it's very understandable. The only thing they negotiate is the amount of power that they can use. There's no pooled funding. If you look at CERN and the Large Hadron Collider, they have an operating budget. This has been put in place by a treaty about 50 years ago. They have an annual operating budget of $1.2 billion per year, but that didn't fund the creation, that did not fund the build of the Large Hadron Collider. That was funded through voluntary contributions from the US and Japan, 2 countries that do not belong to CERN, because they were interested in the outcomes. They wanted the knowledge and the science and were willing to fund it. So the outputs here, though, are quite different from antibiotics in that this is a creation of general knowledge that can be built on. Nobody's going to go out and start selling Higgs bosons. So this treaty was agreed about 50 years ago, but there's a lot of practical problems with conventions that they told us. For example, in a convention, every person that works for that secretariat has diplomatic immunity, which today some of them thought wasn't necessarily desirable. This isn't something that countries maybe want to pursue. There's also a lot of problems with the rigidity of a convention. It's very difficult to change it once it's been negotiated and put in place. And for us, for antibiotics, once we start implementing, there's a tremendous amount of learning that's going to be happening here. And we want to be able to have some flexibility and try to learn and to improve the different steps. So now I'm on dangerous ground because the former head of Sepi is here. So the last, one of the other models that we looked at was Sepi, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. So Sepi focuses right now on 3 different viruses, MERS, Lassa, and Nipah. Now the last 2 are primarily located in developing countries. And that means that it's a little bit easier, perhaps to finance these because you can use development aid budgets. Development aid budgets are a lot easier to get the money out of that instead of the Ministry of Health budget, which are used to fund hospitals and other things in a country that's got a national health service. So Sepi's financed through a lot of different sources, including development aid, but it gets quite a lot of development aid money. But it's getting about 120 to 200 million per year, which is a significant amount of money, and this is a great contribution, but it's not at the same level of antibiotic innovation. And also, Sepi is one of the first in this space, so there wasn't a lot of other organizations financing and working on the development in this space. So it left it wide open to start tackling this. So if we look at the financing characteristics, the financing needs for antibiotics are significant. We think that probably today, the money to pay for antibiotics comes out of the Ministry of Health budget or the Science and Technology budget, or it comes from the private insurance market. There's a lot of established funding mechanisms already, and we looked at those previously, and they're doing a great job. They are going towards the goal and working together. So the question is, how can we look to integrate those existing organizations to make sure that we're all going for the same target? Lastly, is there a need for unilateral participation? Well, not necessarily for antibiotic innovation. There's a need for sustainable use, yes. There's a need for access, yes. But we don't need every single country necessarily to finance antibiotic innovation. Ramanand's going to talk to you about the societal value of antibiotics. And if that societal value is large enough, then countries should be willing to invest the sums that they need. So now, I'm probably going to get into more trouble because I've put some flags up here. This is purely for illustrative purposes only. None of these countries have committed to any financing whatsoever. But this is the example, is that you should be able to, what the countries invest in today should count towards their antibiotic research and development commitments. So what we see that the US makes significant contributions through the NIH, CARB-X, BARDA, the UK, through JPI, AMR, and others. And all of these are good, and we don't want to stop any one of these. But what we want them to do is to work together towards common goals. And by common goals, we mean increased financing in order to fill that pipeline and to get those new antibiotics, and also to focus on the priority pathogens. So if we can do that, if we can get this group to focus on common goals amongst all of these different organizations, then, like the Paris Agreement that Ed mentioned earlier, then we can start seeing some real progress and some significant progress. And the other common goal that has to be there is everybody's got to agree to sustainable use and equitable availability. Now, the G20 has come out and recommended an AMR R&D collaboration hub. And this is a lean organization, as I understand it, that will get all of the G20 countries and others to come together and work together and look at priorities and gaps. And that seems like a perfect place to sit above so that all of these organizations can start talking up. They already talk quite well today, but there's always room for improvement there. And then on the market entry reward, we need to start paying those out. Now this gets a little bit tricky because a market entry reward is something that you pay at regulatory approval. As you all know, Europe doesn't approve drugs at the same time as the US. So to pre-approve a drug or to start paying out a drug in Europe that has not gone through the official approval process does not necessarily work. And as we heard Pierre and Mark and others talk about, context is key. So market entry rewards, there's a lot of variations. David Finley is going to talk to you about this tomorrow. I think the work, Infectious Disease Society of America and Duke Margolis is doing some terrific work on this. for the US market. And we have, the AMR review has also done the global perspective. But the idea is that we should be able to find market entry reward systems that work with the country. They should be able to choose the financing mechanism that works in the context of that country. And as long as we're promoting the same priority pathogens and we're promoting the same principles of sustainable use and equitable availability, the sum of the parts should meet the expectations of the whole. So, here's the very high-level 4 questions I asked in the beginning. The what is 4 interdependent and cohesive models. It's important that we don't think, okay, we like grants, that's easy, we're going to go forward with that, because grants only fills one aspect of the cohesive whole. How much? We estimate that it will cost between 800 and 1.2 billion per year, including existing financing of 550. What will we get? We'll get a pipeline aligned with priority public health needs and potentially 2 novel antibiotics in the next 5 years. And how? Through common commitments to shared goals. Thank you very much.
No. If you want to take
I guess I've been sorry, I've spoken very quickly. I hope I didn't speak too quickly, but I've got 2 minutes left. Anyone want to ask a question? You're all awestruck. Sorry, it's quite sweaty.
Okay, no problem. So you've proposed a great set of ideas based on single agent therapies. Now, antiviral field is dominated by combination therapies where one ingredient can go into several different medicines. This is easy in antibiotics too, I can tell you. We've got loads of these things. Have you thought about that in terms of modeling?
About combination therapies?
Correct.
We did. We talked about this, and the feedback that I received, now I'm not a clinician myself, so maybe I'm saying this poorly, but the understanding that we received from this is that combination is a common practice, and that they will be used, different combinations will be used. And we think that there's need for more evidence in the way that you can combine different antibiotics. That's a definite need. But there wasn't consensus that you needed actually combination therapy pills. But I don't know, maybe somebody else could better answer that.
Yeah, I mean, can I come back on that? I mean,
sure.
That's certainly, I mean, the antiviral field obviously has this. Yeah. We know that our current antibiotics hit many different targets, sometimes 3 or 4 in one particular bacteria. So an easy way of making clean medicines is to combine different combinations. And for different pathogens, you could have A, B, and C for one pathogen, B, C, D, E for another pathogen. So I think we need to look at this because that's I think, the 21st century way of treating bacterial infections. And it's certainly the way we would have done it if we had done antivirals first and then come to bacteria.
Thanks. Very, very good presentation. Really enjoyed it. The market entry reward would be a single one-time payment at 1 to 1.125 billion?
It would be over 5 consecutive years is the idea, because the idea is that that would take off the pressure from the governments to put out such a large sum, and it would also, in the rare case that the product had to be withdrawn, then the payments would stop after the first or second year.
So roughly speaking, about 200 million a year for the 5 years.
No, sorry, the 1 billion is per drug, but so it would be divided by 5 payments. So you get 200. Yeah, 200, sorry. Yes, that's right, what you said, sorry.
Good afternoon. I just had over here. Yeah. I just had a quick question. You said on the market entry rewards, this will come with the strings attached, right? So you talked about 2 principles, sustainable use and equitable availability. And I wanted to find out what does exactly mean with equitable availability, because we have been talking about access and affordability. So what is the definition of this equitable availability?
Equitable availability means that the product is registered in country and made available at an affordable price. So we decided to use this term because access is a much larger, broader perspective, and that has to do with having effective healthcare systems in place. So we thought, what could we actually oblige a developer to do, and that would be to register the product in priority markets and make sure that it was priced affordably.
After this question, maybe if the panel could come up after Christine is finished.
I think Enrico's quite eager.
Just to complement the question about affordability and sustainable use, the requirements of companies are especially specified when it comes to the partially delinked. When it comes to the fully delinked, it works in a slightly different way when it comes to pricing. But you will hear tomorrow.
David will tell you all about that tomorrow.
Yeah, Adrian Towers, just really nice presentation, but a quick question on the numbers because I don't quite understand them. So 800 million a year, so you're saying that's 550 million, you increase that by 50%, so that's most of that. But then you've got 19 new novel drugs and 55 incremental ones coming through in 30 years, and they're each getting $1 billion. So I don't quite see how the numbers add up. I'm confused.
We're just looking at the numbers for the next 5 years, looking at the pipeline. So looking at the existing clinical development pipeline, the thought is that as many as 2 products could potentially satisfy the requirements. Of course, target product profiles, like someone previously said, need to be developed to make sure that they satisfy these. But we thought as many as 2 products could potentially receive a market entry reward. And that's why we're looking at, and since the market entry reward is staged over a number of years, that's how the products are lined up, or the finances is lined up.
Just a follow-up to that question in terms of the global coordination of that. So on your figure where you had sort of a market entry reward, presumably for the G20 countries, if the market entry award for a single product is like $1 billion, or just using your estimate, the reality of that might be that it's $1 billion that comes from potentially 15 to 20 different country market entry rewards, so their contribution might be varied across those 20 countries, but the sum of those would get to the full market entry reward. And so that would take coordination, and I think that's the gray bar that you had at the top.
That's
right?
Exactly right,
Okay.
Greg. And the thought is it doesn't necessarily have to be paid out per country. You can also there's great opportunity for the European Union to work together. We have, Europe has one regulatory agency, and we see some great potential for example, the European Investment Bank to participate in these. So there are different ways, but I think now we're treading into the politics of it. We don't want to do that.
So, wow, I didn't mean to do that, but we are all, if you want to take one more question, we can do that. And then we need to move on to the panel because Christine wasn't expecting Q&A, and she's doing pretty good. So last time.
Christine, thank you for allowing the question. My name is Mark Gitzinger from the Beam Alliance, so representing SME. And I'm wondering, with the market entry awards that are meant to give a better security for a return on invest as well for the private sector, obviously. So the market entry award is paid out once the drug is on the market, but at what stage will companies be able to get a guarantee that this market entry award will be awarded if the drug is successfully marketed at the end? So is that at the entry of clinical trials, after phase 2, etc.? And then the follow-on question is, how is it handled if we have competing companies with the same priority buck, but all being guaranteed a market entry award, and potentially even all of them, hopefully for the companies and for the patients, all of them are successful. So we have, for the same priority buck, potentially 3, 4 drugs coming to the market. So your market entry award will be, well, quite exorbitant. So how is that handled?
I think that's a great question, and I think that's you're a very optimistic person and have a very positive view of the world. So I think I would like to live in that world, and I hope that we come into that space. I think, as Kevin mentioned, I think you said 8 novel products or candidates within the preclinical pipeline, but we'll be lucky if we see 1 or 2 of those coming through. But I think that would be a wonderful problem to have if we're spoiled for choice for novel antibiotics coming to the market.
And when will you decide?
Oh, sorry. It was, we are looking at a pre-qualification, which would come, I'm not sure, end of phase 1, 2, looking where a company could sit down with the regulator and look at the TPP and say, yes, we think that this product would likely qualify for a market entry reward.